The enemy aircraft appeared as dark specks against the afternoon sky, growing larger with each passing second as they closed the distance to Sarah's heavily loaded C-130. Through her headset, she could hear the urgent communications between the incoming Raptor flight fighter jets and their command center as they raced to reach the transport aircraft before enemy forces could engage. Transport 7-4, execute immediate evasive maneuvers, hostile aircraft closing from your 6 o'clock position, came the urgent warning from the lead Raptor pilot. Sarah threw the massive cargo aircraft into a banking turn that pushed the airframe to its structural limits. The wounded soldiers in the cargo hold were secured to stretchers, but the violent maneuvering sent loose equipment sliding across the floor. Rodriguez worked frantically with the aircraft's limited defensive systems, deploying chaff and flares in an attempt to confuse any missile guidance systems that might be targeting them. The C-130 wasn't equipped for air-to-air combat, but it did carry basic countermeasures designed to protect against surface-to-air missiles. Every defensive option would be critical in the coming minutes. The first enemy aircraft swept past them at high speed, its pilot apparently surprised by the transport's aggressive maneuvering. Sarah caught a glimpse of the sleek fighter as it flashed by, noting the foreign markings that confirmed they were facing professional military opposition rather than irregular forces. The enemy pilot would undoubtedly circle back for another attack run with full knowledge of their location and heading. Raptor lead, this is Raptor 2, I have visual contact with hostile aircraft, came the transmission that brought hope to everyone aboard the transport. Sarah could see the American fighter jets approaching from the east, their afterburners creating brilliant points of light against the mountain backdrop. The cavalry had arrived, but the enemy aircraft still held a temporary tactical advantage. The aerial engagement that followed would be remembered by military historians as one of the most unusual dogfights of the conflict. Sarah found herself flying a cargo aircraft through combat maneuvers that would have been impossible in a commercial airliner, using the C-130's rugged construction and powerful engines to avoid destruction while friendly fighters engaged the enemy. Transport, descend to 5,000 feet and follow the valley heading 090, ordered the Raptor flight leader as he positioned his aircraft between the C-130 and the pursuing enemy fighters. Sarah dropped the nose of the transport and dove toward the deck, using the terrain to mask their radar signature while the F-22 pilots engaged their opponents at higher altitude. The radio filled with the professional chatter of air-to-air combat as missiles were fired and aircraft maneuvered at supersonic speeds. Sarah could see the contrails of the engagement overhead while she focused on flying the transport through the winding valley at dangerously low altitude. One mistake in navigation would send them into a mountainside, but staying high meant exposure to enemy fire. Behind her in the cargo hold, the medical team worked to stabilize wounded soldiers while the aircraft pitched and rolled through evasive maneuvers. The dedication of the medical personnel, who continued their life-saving work despite the combat situation, exemplified the courage and professionalism that Sarah had observed throughout this extraordinary day. Splash one hostile aircraft, came the triumphant call from Raptor 2, indicating that one enemy fighter had been destroyed. The engagement continued as the remaining hostile aircraft attempted to break through the protective screen provided by the American fighters. Sarah could see explosions in the sky above them as missiles found their targets and aircraft engaged in close-quarters combat. The valley that had provided concealment suddenly opened into a broader plain, forcing Sarah to make a critical decision about their route. Staying low offered protection from radar detection but limited their options if they encountered additional threats. Climbing to higher altitude would improve their speed and range but expose them to long-range missile attacks. Transport 7-4, this is Bugram Control. We have a clear corridor for you at heading 270. Friendly forces have secured the airspace along that route, came the welcome transmission from their destination airfield. Sarah immediately adjusted course toward the indicated heading while Rodriguez coordinated their approach with air traffic control. The relief of reaching friendly airspace was tempered by the realization that their aircraft had sustained damage during the engagement. Warning lights illuminated the instrument panel, indicating problems with hydraulic systems and possible structural damage from the violent maneuvering and enemy fire. Sarah would need to carefully manage the aircraft's remaining systems during the approach and landing. Raptor flight, outstanding work today. Transport 7-4 is clear of hostile airspace, Sarah transmitted to the fighter pilots who had saved their lives. The professional acknowledgement seemed inadequate for the debt of gratitude she felt toward the pilots who had risked their own lives to protect her aircraft and the wounded soldiers aboard. As they approached Bugram Airfield, Sarah could see emergency vehicles positioning themselves along the runway in preparation for their arrival. The extent of the aircraft's damage would only become clear during the landing, but the priority was getting the wounded soldiers to the medical facility as quickly as possible. The landing approach required careful management of the damaged flight controls, but Sarah's years of experience flying in challenging conditions proved invaluable. The C-130 touched down smoothly on the runway, and she immediately began the shutdown procedures while medical personnel rushed toward the aircraft to begin transferring patients to waiting ambulances. Rodriguez completed the post-flight inspection and confirmed that the aircraft had sustained multiple hits from small arms fire and minor damage from the extreme maneuvering, but all critical systems had continued to function throughout the mission. The rugged construction of the military transport had undoubtedly saved their lives during the combat engagement. As the wounded soldiers were carefully removed from the aircraft and transported to the medical facility, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary events of the day. Her routine supply mission had become a combat rescue operation that tested every skill she possessed as a pilot. The successful evacuation had saved lives, but it had also demonstrated the unpredictable nature of military operations in contested areas. The debriefing that followed would reveal that Viper Squadron had been conducting a classified operation when they were ambushed by superior enemy forces. Without the emergency evacuation provided by Sarah's aircraft, several wounded soldiers would not have survived their injuries. The mission that began as a simple cargo delivery had become a life-saving rescue operation that exemplified the courage and skill of military aviators. Weeks later, Sarah would receive recognition for her actions during the rescue mission, but she insisted that the real heroes were the soldiers who had fought on the ground and the fighter pilots who had protected her aircraft during the evacuation. Her experience as a commercial pilot had provided the foundation for her success, but it was the dedication to saving lives that had motivated her extraordinary performance under combat conditions. The transformation from civilian cargo pilot to combat rescue aviator had occurred in a matter of hours, demonstrating how quickly circumstances can change in military operations. Sarah's story would inspire other civilian contractors working in support of military operations, showing that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when lives are at stake. The wounded soldiers who were evacuated that day would recover from their injuries and return to their families, carrying with them the memory of a civilian pilot who risked everything to bring them home safely. Their survival was a testament to the courage and skill of all the personnel involved in the rescue operation, from the ground forces who secured the landing zone to the fighter pilots who provided air cover. The aircraft that had carried them through the combat zone would be repaired and returned to service, but it would forever bear the scars of that extraordinary day when a routine supply mission became a life-or-death struggle for survival. The bullet holes and stress damage served as permanent reminders of the courage displayed by everyone involved in the successful rescue operation. The descent toward the emergency landing zone tested every skill Sarah had acquired during her aviation career. The C-130's massive frame wasn't designed for the kind of tactical maneuvering required to avoid ground fire while approaching a contested area. As they dropped below 10,000 feet, the radio traffic intensified with reports from Viper Squadron providing real-time updates on enemy positions and the condition of wounded personnel. Transport 7-4, be advised we have small arms fire coming from the ridgeline to your east. Recommend approach from the west using the valley for cover, came the urgent transmission from the ground team leader. Sarah could hear the distinct sound of gunfire in the background, confirming the severity of the situation they were flying into. Rodriguez worked frantically with his charts and instruments, calculating approach angles and identifying potential escape routes if the landing had to be aborted. His military training was evident as he coordinated with multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, maintaining contact with the ground team while monitoring for any additional aircraft in the area that might pose a threat or provide assistance. The improvised landing strip was nothing more than a dirt road that had been partially cleared of debris by the Special Operations Team. It was far shorter than any runway Sarah had ever used, and the approach required flying between two rocky outcroppings that left minimal room for error. The margin for mistake was virtually non-existent, especially with the added pressure of enemy forces potentially targeting their aircraft. As they lined up for the approach, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from weapons positions on the surrounding ridges. The reality of flying into an active firefight struck her with full force as tracer rounds began streaking past the aircraft's windows. The C-130's armor plating provided some protection, but a well-placed shot could still disable critical flight systems or injure crew members. 500 feet and descending, gear down and locked, Rodriguez called out, his voice maintaining professional composure despite the chaos erupting around them. Sarah could feel the aircraft shuddering slightly from the impact of small-caliber rounds against the fuselage, but all critical systems remained operational as they continued their hazardous descent. The ground rushed up toward them as Sarah fought to maintain precise control over the heavily loaded aircraft. The shortened runway left no room for a normal landing approach, forcing her to use techniques she had only practiced in emergency scenarios. The touchdown had to be perfect, with immediate maximum braking to avoid overrunning the limited space available. The main landing gear struck the rough surface with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the entire airframe. Sarah immediately deployed the aircraft's reverse thrust and applied maximum braking, feeling the C-130 strain against its own momentum as it decelerated on the improvised airstrip. Dust clouds erupted from the wheels, creating a brown haze that temporarily obscured their view of the surrounding area. Before the aircraft had completely stopped rolling, Sarah could see members of Viper's squadron emerging from defensive positions around the landing zone. Several team members were carrying wounded comrades toward the aircraft, moving with urgent purpose while maintaining tactical awareness of potential threats from enemy positions. The sight of injured soldiers being rushed towards safety drove home the critical importance of their mission. Cargo ramp opening, medical personnel standing by, Rodriguez announced as the aircraft's rear loading ramp began lowering. Sarah kept the engines running and the aircraft positioned for a rapid departure, knowing that every second on the ground increased their vulnerability to enemy fire. The sound of gunfire continued to echo off the surrounding mountains, indicating that the firefight was far from over. The loading process proceeded with military efficiency as wounded soldiers were quickly but carefully brought aboard the aircraft. Sarah could see through her side window that some of the injuries were severe, making the urgency of their evacuation even more critical. Medical personnel who had been part of Viper's squadron worked to stabilize patients while preparing them for transport to advanced medical facilities. During the loading, an unexpected radio transmission changed the dynamics of their situation entirely. Transport 7-4, this is Falcon Base. We have confirmed enemy air assets approaching your position. Multiple hostile aircraft inbound from the north, estimated time to contact 8 minutes. The announcement sent a chill through Sarah's spine as she realized that their rescue mission had just become exponentially more dangerous. Enemy aircraft meant they were no longer dealing with just ground-based threats, but potentially facing air-to-air combat for which their cargo aircraft was completely unsuited. The C-130 had no defensive weapons and would be helpless against fighter aircraft or attack helicopters. Rodriguez immediately began calculating their options while coordinating with ground forces about the status of the loading operation. The team leader from Viper Squadron reported that they had successfully loaded all wounded personnel but still had equipment and classified materials that needed to be evacuated. The approaching enemy aircraft forced a critical decision about whether to wait for complete evacuation or depart immediately with the wounded. "How much time do we need to finish loading?" Sarah asked over the intercom, knowing that every minute of delay increased their risk of being caught on the ground by hostile aircraft. The response came back quickly: 3 more minutes for essential equipment, 5 minutes for everything. Sarah made the command decision that would haunt her thoughts for years to come: we take off in 90 seconds with whatever is loaded. We cannot risk the aircraft and wounded personnel against incoming air threats. The decision meant leaving behind equipment and potentially important intelligence materials, but the lives of the injured soldiers took absolute priority. The loading ramp closed with mechanical precision as the remaining members of Viper's squadron secured themselves in the cargo area. Sarah advanced the throttles and began the takeoff roll, knowing that this departure would be even more dangerous than their landing. The aircraft was now loaded with additional personnel and equipment, affecting its performance characteristics during the critical climb-out phase. As the C-130 lifted off the improvised runway, Sarah could see dust trails in the distance that indicated the approach of enemy vehicles toward their former position. The timing of their departure had been critical, as remaining on the ground for even a few more minutes could have resulted in disaster for everyone aboard the aircraft. The climb away from the landing zone required flying through the same valley they had used for approach, but now with the added complication of enemy aircraft somewhere in the area. Rodriguez worked the radio frantically, trying to establish contact with any friendly forces that might provide fighter escort or at least early warning about the location of hostile aircraft. "Contact bearing 270, range 12 miles and closing fast," came the ominous report from an unknown radio source. Sarah realized that they were about to face the ultimate test of her flying abilities as she attempted to evade military aircraft designed specifically for air-to-air combat. The peaceful commercial flights of her past seemed like a distant memory as she prepared for the fight of her life. The aircraft's defensive warning systems began emitting urgent tones as radar signatures appeared on their threat detection equipment. Enemy aircraft were actively searching for them, and engagement was now imminent. Sarah pushed the C-130 to its maximum performance limits while searching for terrain features that might provide concealment or tactical advantage. The radio crackled with transmission from an unexpected source that would change everything. Transport 74, this is Raptor Flight. We are inbound to provide air cover. Hold your current heading and altitude, we will be on station in 3 minutes. The arrival of friendly fighter aircraft offered hope, but 3 minutes seemed like an eternity when facing imminent combat engagement. Sarah's hands gripped the flight controls with determination as she prepared to use every skill and instinct developed over more than 2 decades of flying. The cargo hold behind her contained wounded soldiers whose lives depended on her ability to outfly and outmaneuver aircraft specifically designed for aerial combat. The peaceful supply mission had become a life-or-death struggle that would test the limits of both aircraft and pilot. Captain Sarah Mitchell had always believed that 22 years of commercial aviation experience meant she had seen everything the sky could throw at her. Flying passengers from New York to Los Angeles, navigating through thunderstorms over the Midwest, and managing emergency landings during mechanical failures had shaped her into one of the most respected pilots at Continental Airways. But nothing in her extensive training had prepared her for what would unfold on a seemingly routine humanitarian mission over Afghanistan. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection of the massive C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. This wasn't her usual Boeing 737, but when the Department of Defense contracted civilian pilots for urgent supply missions, experienced aviators like Sarah were called upon. The cargo bay held critical medical supplies, food rations, and communication equipment destined for a remote outpost near Kandahar where American forces were providing humanitarian aid to local villages. Sarah's co-pilot, Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez, was a young military officer with impressive credentials but limited combat experience. His nervous energy was palpable as he reviewed the flight plan for the 3rd time. The route would take them over contested territory where Taliban forces had been increasingly active, but intelligence reports suggested the sky should be clear of threats during their scheduled flight window. "Ma'am, I've flown cargo runs before, but never in a potential hot zone," Rodriguez admitted as they settled into the cockpit. His honesty was refreshing in a world where military bravado often masked genuine concern. Sarah appreciated his straightforward approach and recognized the importance of clear communication between crew members, especially when flying into uncertain situations. The aircraft's engines roared to life with a thunderous rumble that vibrated through every rivet and bolt. Sarah had grown accustomed to the smooth hum of commercial jet engines, but the raw power of the military transport's turboprops reminded her of the serious nature of their mission. As they taxied toward the runway, she could see other military aircraft preparing for various operations, each carrying personnel and equipment vital to ongoing efforts in the region. Air traffic control cleared them for takeoff, and Sarah smoothly advanced the throttles. The heavily loaded aircraft required a longer takeoff roll than usual, but she had calculated the performance parameters carefully. As the C-130 lifted off the runway and climbed toward their cruising altitude of 28,000 feet, the landscape below transformed from the controlled environment of the airfield to the rugged, mountainous terrain that characterized much of Afghanistan. The first hour of flight passed without incident. Sarah monitored the instruments while Rodriguez handled communications with various control centers along their route. The aircraft's defensive systems remained quiet, showing no signs of ground-based threats. The weather was clear, offering excellent visibility of the dramatic landscape below, where ancient trade routes wound through valleys that had witnessed centuries of conflict and cooperation. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Rodriguez received an unexpected radio transmission that would change the course of their mission entirely. The voice crackled through their headsets with urgent intensity. "Transport 74, this is Viper Squadron. We have troops in contact approximately 15 miles northeast of your current position. Emergency medical evacuation required immediately." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as the implications of the message became clear. Viper Squadron was a designation she recognized from briefings as belonging to an elite special operations unit. If they were calling for emergency evacuation, the situation on the ground was undoubtedly severe. The original mission to deliver supplies would have to wait while they responded to soldiers in immediate danger. "Viper Squadron, Transport 74 responding. What is your situation?" Rodriguez replied, his voice steady despite the tension that had suddenly filled the cockpit. Sarah was already reaching for the tactical charts to identify potential landing zones in the area where the unit was reportedly engaged. The squadron leader's voice painted a grim picture. "We have multiple wounded requiring immediate evacuation. Our original extraction helicopter took heavy fire and had to abort. We're holding a defensive position, but enemy forces are closing in. We need immediate air support for evacuation." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the information. The C-130 wasn't designed for tactical combat operations, but its ability to land on rough airstrips made it potentially suitable for emergency evacuation if they could find an appropriate landing zone. The risk was enormous, as they would be flying into an active combat situation without the protective escort that military aircraft typically received during such operations. Rodriguez, get me everything you can about that area. Topographical data, known landing strips, enemy activity reports, everything, Sarah commanded as she began adjusting their course toward the coordinates provided by Viper Squadron. Her commercial aviation background had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but this situation demanded skills and decision-making abilities that went far beyond normal flight operations. As they changed course, Sarah could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The lives of wounded soldiers depended on her ability to safely navigate into a combat zone and execute a successful evacuation. The irony wasn't lost on her that after 2 decades of peaceful commercial flights, she would face her greatest challenge while flying a military aircraft over one of the world's most dangerous regions. The radio crackled again with updates from the ground team. Enemy forces were advancing on their position, and the wounded soldiers needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided at a proper medical facility. Time was running out, and every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death for the brave men and women fighting below. Sarah pushed the throttles forward, increasing their speed toward the combat zone while simultaneously calculating the risks and possibilities for a successful rescue mission. The clear morning sky that had seemed so peaceful just moments before now felt ominous, as if hiding unseen dangers that could emerge at any moment. The transformation from routine supply mission to emergency combat evacuation would test every skill she had developed throughout her aviation career. The aircraft's defensive system suddenly activated with a series of warning tones that sent adrenaline coursing through both pilots. Radar contacts appeared on their screens, indicating aircraft approaching from multiple directions. The peaceful supply mission had become a race against time to save lives while avoiding engagement with enemy forces that could appear without warning. Rodriguez's voice carried new urgency as he coordinated with ground forces and attempted to establish contact with any friendly aircraft in the area that might provide protective cover. Sarah focused on flying the aircraft while processing the rapidly changing tactical situation that would soon require split-second decisions with life-or-death consequences. The mountains below seemed to close in around them as they descended toward the combat zone, where American soldiers were fighting for their lives while waiting for salvation from the sky. Sarah gripped the controls tighter, knowing that the next 30 minutes would either result in a successful rescue or disaster that would haunt her for the rest of her life.